Right, is it me? Beauty. Hey, well, it's always good to be here with everyone at Charlestown. I must admit, it's good that the lockdown has finished for us all, although I must admit, in my life, I just really stopped and think, has it made any difference? Because we're now become so entrenched in a Zoom culture that even though I'm technically allowed to leave my house and allowed to go into another LGA, and I could even drive up to Tamworth if I wanted to, the bottom line is I'm too busy to do any of that. And I think this week I've left the house once. The good news is that once was to go and have tea last night with Callan and Hannah. So it was nice to go down to their place and catch up with them. And they're almost like normal adults. Like, it's a bit scary how your dominant feeling of the kids in your house is that you're still changing their nappy, and then you see them in their late 20s sort of living what seems to be a pretty good life. It's a bit amazing. I just wonder if it's my genetic influence or Deborah's. Maybe that's for something that you can contemplate after the service is over. Or maybe we could have a vote now. That'd be a good one. I can still have you. Let's have hands up if it's me. Is that your hand up? Thank you, Pam. One hand. What? Henry? For God's sake, Henry. All right. Who thinks it's Deborah? I tell you, it just shows you how in lockdown, how delusional you've all become. However, what I am here today is to correct the record a little, not so much about our kids, but about your delusions. So let me just start by sharing the screen with you. Today's talk I've actually called "Don't Worry About a Thing," because every little thing is going to be all right. Now, for some of you, you may in fact heard about that song before. It might even be a bit catchy for you, but we'll come back to that a little bit later in the talk. I want to start off by taking us to the MCG on the 24th of July, 2013. Now, in that place, you had, for the first time, Melbourne Victory were playing Liverpool United, one of the world's greatest football teams. And on July 24, 95,446 people turned up to see them. Liverpool colours are red, and just looking to see a people there, who do you think all those Melburnians were barracking for? And so we found that the stadium was chockers full of Aussies who were Liverpool fans. It was just amazing. Now, I'm going to try a video on Zoom. Video on Zoom doesn't work that well, so I apologise in advance for some of the quality on this. But what I want to do is just have a little listen to these guys, because one of the things about the English football teams, they all have a song, and let's listen to Liverpool's song. All right, so I can think from the shaking of your head, you couldn't hear it. So let me just tell you what it was. Liverpool, the song's actually Walk On, You'll Never Walk Alone. And so the lyric goes, walk through the wind, walk on through the rain, though your dreams be tossed and blown, walk on with hope in your heart, and you'll never walk alone. Now, I must admit, could anybody hear that? Give me a thumbs up if you could hear it. Okay, so no, I can hear it. All right, so there's some sort of hassle going on with my computer. So the bottom line is the lyric, though, is that you'll never walk alone. And it got me thinking, why is it that these football teams, why is it that they use these songs as their anthems that quite often have some sort of fairly high-level social, sometimes even spiritual theme to them? Why is the team like Liverpool saying, walk on with hope in your heart, and you'll never walk alone? I know that sport, you're quite often aspirational, you're looking to win, and sometimes it can get tough. Now, in the lockdown, the temptation is to watch too much television. I, on the other hand, probably prefer to read a few books. And so I've just been reading this book called Australia's Toughest Sport People. And this guy goes through a number of Australian sporting legends and how when the times got tough, you know, they sort of stood up to be counted, often for the sake of their country. I just want to share a couple of the stories with you. The first one's actually the guy from the cover, who is Rick McCosker. Now, Rick McCosker is actually the guy at the back in the very center of the photo who is smiling, although they're all smiling. And so he is there walking out, and he's an opening batsman. And we know that on that day in 1977, that Bob Willis bowled down a bouncer. Obviously, this was pre-helmet days. The only way to defend yourself from these bouncers is that you either ducked out of the way to try to hit it. And McCosker, being a reasonably aggressive batsman, although not that flamboyant, but inside the line of the ball and tried to hit it and missed it altogether, and it came flying through and hit him right in the jaw and managed to break his jaw in 3 places. So he was sort of carried off, fairly badly injured. They took him to the hospital. The hospital had a look there and they said, well, you know, it's an operation. We've got to reset your jaw. And his reply to that was, I may need to bat again. He didn't even want any sort of like general anaesthetic, but rather just using localized anaesthetic. They actually temporarily wired his jaw. Then they made up the equivalent of a mouth guard, which they then put in his teeth. And then they clenched his jaw together. Then they thought, right, if any of this moves, he'll be in trouble. So then what they did is that they just wrapped his head around in bandages to keep his whole face frozen. And he went back to the ground, and they knew, the Australians knew, that they didn't have enough runs because the MCG wicket was getting flat. And he went back in at number 10. And that's what he looked like. And as you can see from these sort of photos, face very swollen. And but everything sort of held together with bits of wire and bandages. Now, you would think that the first few overs, the English played fairly nice, just bowling the ball up to him, but he knew it was coming. And sure enough, Bob Willis, the villain who had broken his jaw in the first place, sends down another bouncer directly at him. And Rick McCosker stood there, got inside the line of the ball and hit it for 6. I mean, I don't know if any of you had a broken jaw, but let me tell you, that takes courage. He managed to stay in there with Rod Marsh. He wasn't out when they came to the end of the innings, went back in this morning. Rod Marsh went on to get a century. Their partnership was worth 52 runs, McCosker and Marsh, and in the end of the day, Australia won by 45. So if he hadn't gone back out there, the game would have been lost. You've got John Sattler. John Sattler is a rugby league immortal. John Sattler played for South Sydney, as you can see there. He was captain of South Sydney for 3 years during the early 1970s. So he captained South to 4 premierships, in fact, between 1967 and 71. But his most famous one was in 1970, where in the first minutes of the game, he fractured his jaw, told his teammates to hold him up so the opposition would not know he was hurt. And then he played on for the next 75 minutes as South won the grand final. Something that, of course, we'd frown on today because of the concussion protocols. You have then Alyssa Tamplin. Now, Alyssa Tamplin, as we know, is an aerial skier. She rocked up to the Olympics, but just prior to the Olympics, several weeks out, in fact, she had a training accident where it was quite windy and she was blown off course, and she landed very heavily. And she could barely walk after the crash, and they diagnosed her with bone bruising. But then on closer examination by the doctors in Salt Lake City, they discovered that both her ankles were broken. This happened 3 weeks prior to the Olympic Games. But against medical advice, she fronted up to the Olympics because Jackie Cooper, who was Australia's best hope for a medal, an aerial skier, had injured her knee in practice before the games and could no longer compete. So Alyssa Tamplin rocked up, and despite having 2 fractured ankles, went on to a famous victory and won a gold medal for Australia. Just absolutely incredible. Absolutely incredible. You know, and obviously she was very emotional about the whole thing at the ceremony because of what she had to go through to get there. And of course, you get Dean Jones. Dean Jones, a Victorian batsman, an aggressive batsman. And then he comes out and they're playing India in Madras. And when they're they were playing, and it was in 1986, and the conditions were horrific. They were hot and humid, and Dean Jones was out there overcome with exhaustion, fatigue, and dehydration. And in between overs, he was just constantly vomiting on the mound. And he went to Alan Border, the captain, and said that he wanted to retire because he was ill. Now, you can retire because you're hurt, but you can also retire because you're ill. Alan Border, the sympathetic soul he is known for looking Dean Jones in the eye, who just vomited on the ground, and said, if you can't handle the conditions, I'll get a Queenslander who can. Because Greg Ritchie was due to come in next, and he was a Queenslander, and he said, so you can stand aside and let the Queenslander do the job, or you can go back out there and do it yourself. And Dean Jones returned to the crease and went on to make 210. To this day, it's gone down in cricket folklore as one of the greatest innings ever by an Australian batsman. Anna Meares, who was heading to the Olympics and just weeks out from the Olympics, had a major crash and fractured a neck. And with that, she then went to the Olympics and ended up getting silver with a neck that had barely repaired, and then turned up 4 years later, and despite a tussle with the English rider, managed to take out gold. Well, Gillian Rowe. Now, Gillian was in the equestrian. She was competing in the 1996 Atlanta Olympics, and as she came up to one of the cross-country jumps, her horse skidded and couldn't make the jump, and she was thrown as her horse hit the barrier. She was thrown off, and she fractured her collarbone and 4 of her ribs, I think it was, 4 ribs and a fractured collarbone. And with that, because it's a team event, she knew that her team was relying on her. So they grabbed the horse, and she climbed back on that horse and went back and came back and jumped. And then she continued until she came to the water jump. And when she got to the water jump, she could only hold the reins in one hand because her left-hand side was completely useless to her due to the multiple fractures. And so she fell off in the water jump, but she climbed back on and finished the course. And the points that she managed to get for her team ultimately saw them win medals, and the gold medal at that. Just an amazing story. But in case you think that I'm a bit addicted to sport, let me tell you that when it comes to these sort of Aussie heroes, you don't just have to look on the sporting field. You see people like John Curtin, who is the only Prime Minister to come from Western Australia, who famously, he was the Prime Minister of Australia during the World War II. And famously realising that Britain was more engaged in the Northern Hemisphere war, Curtin delivered his famous New Year's message where he said, I make it quite clear that Australia looks to America, free from any pangs as to our traditional links with the United Kingdom. And it absolutely infuriated Winston Churchill that Australia was moving to the US, but we know it was a good call because the US ultimately came down and saved our bacon. You got guys like Eddie Mabo, who believed that the country that his family was on should belong to him. He was born in 1936 on Murray Island in the Torres Strait. And it was him, with the help of a lawyer friend, who ultimately took the government to court so that he could have title of the land that his family had lived on in the Torres Strait. Unfortunately, riddled with cancer, he died in January of 1992 at age just 55, but it was 5 months later that the High Court of Australia ruled in his favour that the land, in fact, did belong to the Indigenous people. Well, you get Edith Cowan. Edith Cowan was a tough woman, and she had a compassionate calling, though, and she was born in Geraldton. Now, Debbie's father used to be the pastor of Geraldton Church. It's about 400 kilometres north of Perth. It really is like a fishing outpost, Geraldton. But she was born there in 1861, and she was only 7 when her mother died, and she was just a teenager when her father was hanged for killing his second wife. Now, you would think with that sort of start in life, what hope would she have? But in 1921, she won a seat of West Perth in the WA election, and she was the first woman ever to enter the Australian Parliament. And she... now they have obviously a university in West Australia named after her, Edith Cowan University. Then you have Barry Marshall. Barry Marshall is a guy who put his own health at risk in that to prove stomach ulcers weren't caused by stress and spicy food, but rather a bacteria. he swallowed a glass of Helobacteria pylori, I think you say it, and he became sick and developed gastritis, and then he treated himself with antibiotics and cured himself, thus proving that in actual fact, ulcers were caused by bacteria rather than spicy food. And lastly, you've got Twiggy Forrest. Now, Twiggy Forrest has been on the news lately because he's been standing there with premiers talking about renewable energy, particularly green hydrogen. And with green hydrogen, you've got the fact that you create hydrogen by using renewable electricity made by solar and wind. It, through a process of electrolysis, creates hydrogen out of water. You then store that, and in his proposal, they're storing it not as hydrogen gas because it's very explosive, but storing it as ammonia. And then from there, you can transport it quite safely as ammonia and then convert it back to hydrogen when you need it. And I was looking at Ziggy Forrest and I was reading his biography on Wikipedia. And then the very last thing it says, it's told all about his exploits. And then down the bottom of it, and I'm just reading it here off my screen, and actually you get to the bottom of the whole thing and it finally says, Forrest is a Christian and is married with 3 children. Now, when I read that, and I'd been reading this book about all these different heroes, and I thought about the great heroes of the world, particularly Australian heroes, who are just incredible people, I actually started having a thought, you know what? God needs heroes. God needs heroes. If people can do those sort of heroic acts for sport or in service to their community and country by being politicians or being businessmen, God needs heroes and people like that. And of course, God hasn't been short of us. In actual fact, as we heard in the children's story, there's that story there of Esther, who, realizing that Haman was out to kill all the Jews, went before the king, knowing that if she wasn't accepted, she would die. And that verse in Esther 14, verse 15 and 16, Esther sent back her answer to Mordecai, who'd asked her, to go and try and intervene for the Jews' behalf. And Esther sent back her answer and said, go and get all the Jews living in Susa together. Fast for me. Don't drink or eat or drink for 3 days, either day or night. I and my maids will fast with you. If you do this, I'll go to the king, even though it's forbidden. If I die, I die. I mean, that's courage, isn't it? I'm here to say that Esther is one of God's heroes because she went there. Now, as we know, the story had a happy ending because the king actually allowed her to come into his presence and she wasn't killed. And in fact, God's people were saved through the intervention of Esther. Amazing, one of God's great heroes. And then, of course, you've got people like Paul. This is just a picture depicting Paul writing some of his works, although we know that he used to scribe. And when you look at what Paul said in 2 Corinthians 11, he actually said there, I've worked much harder, been jailed more often, beaten up more times than I can count. And at death's door, time after time, I've been flogged 5 times with the Jews' 39 lashes, beaten by Roman rods 3 times, pummeled with rocks once. I've been shipwrecked 3 times and have been immersed in the open sea for a day and a night. This guy, what he went through in doing God's service. He then sort of concludes this bit saying, it's hard traveling year in and year out. I've had to ford rivers, fend off robbers, struggle with friends, struggle with foes. I've been at risk in the city, at risk in the country, endangered by desert sun and sea storm, and betrayed by those I thought were my brothers. I've known drudgery and hard labour, many a long and lonely night without sleep, many a missed meal, blasted by the cold, naked to the weather. Mate, Paul has got to be one of, he's just got to be one of God's heroes. Now, we're just going to pause here for 2 secs. What we're going to do is that we're just going to jump into some breakout rooms. And what I want to do, I think Bob will go for 5 rooms, eh? So I'm just going to split you into rooms, and I want you to come up with 2 people who are one of your heroes. Number 1, I want a secular person, like a sporting person or somebody in Australian society who's your hero. And number two, I want a biblical character. So what are your two heroes? So jump into your breakout rooms and just come up with each room. I want a name of an Australian and secondly, a biblical character who are both heroes to you.
Recording in progress. Recording in progress. Recording in progress. Recording in progress.
All right, people. So welcome back. I had a very interesting experience in that I ended up being in a breakout room, first of all with Reg, and then somehow Reg went away, and then I ended up being in a breakout room with Bob. And so I was actually shuffled around my breakout rooms. But what I will tell you is that speaking on behalf of Reg, the one good thing Reg said before he disappeared off my screen was that the person that he looks up to and admired, you know, as a standout sort of Australian was John Howard. And you've got to admit, 22 years in politics, you know, John Howard was a pretty impressive individual. But let's hear from a few other groups in terms of, I'd like to know, by the way, in talking to Bob, his standout hero was Moses out of the Bible. And Bob, I think, who was there, could speak for himself, but just he liked the fact that Moses was a bit of a renegade and not break the rules, but sort of came out victorious for God at the end. And so that was a pretty cool thing. But let me just shoot around just a couple of other people. Right, Ross Howard, are you young enough? Do you know how to unmute mute yourself?
How's that?
Perfect.
But we elected Francine as our spokesman, Peter.
No,
Okay.
go for it, Ross. Go for it.
Go on, Fran.
Well,
Francine, you're on.
we decided that we needed two Australian heroes, so we chose Yvonne Goolagong Cawley and Debbie Beamish, and for yeah, you know, equally, Debbie Beamish had to be in there, and we chose Moses too, Bob. We thought Moses was pretty much a hero because we figured, you know, the Israelites would still be making bricks without straw if he hadn't been obedient and gone before Pharaoh. So Debbie Beamish, Yvonne Goolagong Cawley, and Moses.
You just don't realise how much support Deborah gets. All right, just somebody else put up a hand in terms of who was in another group who could just volunteer, because I want to move on. I just want to hear back from a couple of others. All right, no hands, so shame it.
I'm happy to share ours.
Okay, yeah, go Nerida. Yep.
Okay, well, most of us, Joseph was our all-time hero. You know, because family's a big thing, but to have them turn against you is pretty tough. And he just stuck with his beliefs. And I really liked Joy's choice. She liked more than, didn't name one, but women in Australia who was standing up against domestic violence, because it's not something a lot of people want to talk about. It's underfunded in so many ways. And I think they are pretty heroic to stand up. Yep.
All right. Really good. All right, Henry, tell me, Henry, who's your heroes? My screen is frozen with Henry, so maybe his internet connection is not that great. Okay, Bob, why don't you tell us the other hero you told me? Apart from Moses, you had one other. What was that?
Greg Chappell.
Why did you like Greg Chappell?
I liked his style, but I was taken to a cricket game at the Wacker, and I don't know what year it was, but I was there for his first innings, and he made a century, and I think Australia won, and they were playing the Windies, I think, because Gary Sobers was there.
Amazing. I mean, these are all great people. Let me just go back to sharing my screen again. But let me just ask this question. What about us? What about us? Could we, in fact, be one of God's heroes? You know, we often talk about all these people that have just been mentioned, but can we, Charlestown church members, can we be one of God's heroes? There's no doubt, you know, we know God needs them. And the Apostle Paul made it quite clear in Romans when he said, those of us who are strong and able in the faith need to step in and lend a hand to those who falter and not just do what is most convenient for us. He goes on and says, this for service, not status. Each one of us needs to look after the good of people around us, asking ourselves, how can we help? And so this is the message that we sort of get, that, yeah, what, as Christians, we actually should be doing something. And I can't see any reasons why we can't be heroes. But the hassle that we have, I think that in many ways, COVID has distorted things a little bit. But at the same stage, while it's really played havoc in our life over the last 2 years, I think there's actually some quite valuable lessons that we can learn from COVID with respect to what it means to be a Christian in 2021 and in the 21st century. And I just want to finish with these lessons as we try and wrap up in the next sort of 5 minutes. The first thing is that one of the things COVID's done, it's actually challenged us with these stay-at-home orders. And, you know, we were in a situation that during lockdown, we're essentially only meant to leave our homes for sort of quite essential reasons. Now, you know, sometimes that's work-related, you know, sometimes it's go to the shop and get supplies, etc. But essentially, we were meant to be locked in at home to stop the spread of the virus and to keep ourselves safe. But when I think about that lockdown and the fact that for a lot of us, we stopped sort of just mixing like we normally do, I actually think it metaphorically, it sort of highlighted for me an issue that the church has had for a long time anyway, in that the church has actually been quite good at locking itself up and stopping itself from sort of mixing a fair bit. And in fact, when you talk to some Adventists and you ask them what the Adventist church's role is in Australian society, they will say we should be in the world, but not of the world. And that's a very common catchphrase that you hear all the time, that we should be in the world, but not of the world. And I was just reading a book on this, and the author put it this way, which I thought was quite good. He goes, rats, we're frustratingly stuck in this old world, but let's marshal our best energies to not be of it. That's the sort of emphasis that's given. But if you think that that should be the church's slogan, I'm just wondering, have you actually ever read the verses in the Bible where Jesus talks about being in the world and of the world? So let's just turn to them very quickly, and they're in John 17. And the verses go like this: I have given them your word. Remember, Jesus is saying this just before he's taken away and crucified. He's talked to his disciples, and then he prays and he says to his Father, I've given them your word, and the world hates them because they do not belong to the world, just as I do not belong to the world. He's talking about his disciples. Then he keeps going and he says, I'm not asking you, in talking to his Father, to take them out of the world, but to keep them safe from the evil one. They do not belong in this world any more than I do. Make them holy by your truth. Teach them your word, which is truth. And then finally, verse 18, just as you sent me into the world, I am sending them into the world. So when we think about this, I want you to know when we say we're meant to be in the world but not of the world, it's actually completely back to front. Because when you read these verses, and if I just go back to the beginning, where it says, I've given them your word, and the world hates them because they do not belong to the world, just as I do not belong. Right? I'm not asking you to take them out of the world. In actual fact, what we find is that not of the world is the starting point of this verse. It's not the end point. When we say we should be in the world but not of the world, it means that being not of the world is where we want to end up, but it's not. Jesus uses that as the start. In recognition, as Christians, we are not of this world. However, in Christ's verse there in John 17, he finishes up by saying, but I'm sending them into the world. He says to his Father, I don't want you to take them out of the world. I'm sending them into the world. So what I would do is actually think we should be changing, we're in the world but not of the world, to rather a slogan that says, we're not of the world, but we've been sent into it. Now, that is in actual fact the logical sequence that comes out of Jesus' text, the text of Jesus praying in John. We're not of this world, but we're sent into it. And so there is nothing there of what Jesus says in John 17 that says that we should be hiding away, sort of being separate, self-isolating if you want, so that we don't catch the contagion of sin. Everything Jesus says is we are not of this world, but we are to be sent into it. And so he's saying to his Heavenly Father, you protect these people. And he says to his disciples, and you guys get ready because you're going into the world to do my work. And that, I believe, is the dominant ethic that the church should have, but alas, it is not. The second lesson I'd like to bring out that I think that we've learned during COVID is the strength of protective practices. And I suppose that we've regularly seen, and I certainly hear my wife regularly complain about the protective gear that she has to work as a nurse in a hospital these days. But even now, of course, if you go anywhere that in a shopping centre, this is now the norm where people are meant to be socially distancing. And even if you're double vaxxed, you're still required to wear a mask, etc. And it is a reminder to me that what we should be doing is that as we are sent into the world, we should actually be donning God's protective clothing. And we know what that is. It's clear from Ephesians 6. We should have that helmet of salvation, the breastplate of righteousness, the belt of truth, the shield of faith, the sandals of readiness, and the sword of the Spirit. And do we actually take those things seriously as the protective clothing that we need? And lastly, I think that what COVID has actually caused me to reflect on is how we manage risk. See, for a lot of people, self-isolation and sort of being separate from the world where COVID is has been a safe practice. And a lot of people have felt secure in their homes, and that's the safest place to be. Some parents, I might add, are probably getting a little bit sick of being in the home with their kids, particularly homeschooling. But it is interesting, you know, parents have done all sorts of innovative things. I like my friend who's in our, he's a paragliding instructor in Sydney. He sent me this message yesterday, and he said last day of homeschooling fee, and he actually had his daughter helping him pack his reserve parachute on his paraglider, and that was her homeschooling lesson of the day. What I want you to do, though, all this sort of staying at home and keeping yourself separate, I just want to remind you that there are consequences to it. There are consequences. Now, in Matthew 25, when Jesus was asked when is you coming back, he actually said two quite clear, first of all, he said, I don't know where I'm coming back, only my Father knows. But his two dominant messages I've preached before in the church about is, while you're waiting for me, I want you to develop yourself and he told the story of the parable of the talents and how he sort of condemned the guy that just went back and just hid his talent in the ground. Jesus said, I want you to develop yourself. But what you've got to do, what does developing yourself mean? If you look at Maslow's hierarchy of needs that we're trying to fulfill in our lives, you know, we have these basic sort of physiological needs, you know, water, food, shelter, sleep, etc. Then we come up to our safety needs. What I want you to know is that the people who stop at that safety level, I'm going to do whatever I need to do to keep myself safe, they are often prevented from going higher in the hierarchy because their attention is focused on that safety. And developing yourself is not keeping yourself safe. Developing yourself is to try and get to the level of self-actualization, and you've got to try and navigate a way to there. I want you to introduce you to a guy by the name of Damien Cave. Damien Cave is he was a journalist. He is a journalist, and he works for the New York Times. He was one of the journalists in the New York Times in New York. And, you know, he's an experienced journalist. Like during the Iraqi war, he was actually a foreign correspondent in Iraq with his wife, and they worked, you know, right at the war front there. And he had a lot of experience. But they were getting a little bit delusioned with the big city life in New York. And when an opportunity came up, he actually found out that the New York Times was trying to increase its readership base. And they found out there was a whole lot of people in Australia reading the New York Times. And so they decided to set up a bureau office in Sydney. And he was approached if he would go and become the head of the Australian Bureau in Sydney of the New York Times. And he took up that job offer. So he found himself with his wife and his 2 kids in Sydney. And they got a house in Bronte, so they weren't far from Bondi Beach and the like. And while they're walking along the beach one day, they noticed all these little kids in the surf, and these were the nippers. And what they were doing is that they were all swimming through the waves under the guidance of the senior lifesavers, and they were all racing and doing all sorts of stuff. And him and his wife were very confronted by this, in that he found that they were looking on an activity that they thought was very, very unsafe. But suddenly they found that these kids seemed to be going okay. No one seemed to be drowning. What they were a little bit horrified by it all, but they went home and had a chat about it and thought, look, we're into Australia. We're in Australia now. We ought to adopt some Australian practices. So what they did is they went and enrolled their kids in the nippers. And he documents the story. I highly recommend you read his book called Into the Rip by Damien Cave. Don't you love the byline? How the Australian way of risk made my family stronger, happier, and less American. So no offense, Francine, we actually consider you one of us, but it seems that it's an advantage being less American. What he does in this, he talked about the fact that his kids were actually scared of the water, but his daughter, who pled with them not to make her go back to nippers after her first go, she pled. But after 2 or 3 nipper sessions, suddenly she was starting to lead her pack. She was getting more confident swimming. And soon she was actually at the head of a little brigade, and she became one of the best swimmers there, as their son did as well. And he documents in the book, he said, suddenly it wasn't just their confidence increased in the surf, in other aspects of their life. Like my son actually started doing other things, including surfing, which you think, okay, that's not too far from life-saving. But then he started at home to do several hobbies, and even public speaking, something that he was terrified of. And the daughter decided that she had the confidence that she always wanted to do ballet lessons, and she then went and did her ballet lessons and became quite a confident young lady. And Damien Cave actually said, who would have thought that just such what seemed to us a high-risk activity would build our students' confidence to the point that they're now embracing life with a passion. But I'm not surprised, because the Apostle Paul in Romans many, many years ago wrote, but that's not all. We gladly suffer because we know that suffering helps us to endure, and endurance builds character, which gives us a hope that will never disappoint. You see, what we're told to do is to develop ourselves. And I'm here to tell you that developing yourself doesn't mean locking yourself up and staying safe. Developing yourself means challenging yourself, and it doesn't have to be in some sort of extreme sport. It can be challenging yourself in terms of the people you mix with, challenging yourself in terms of the hobbies that you do, or the way that you spend your time. And some of those challenges aren't going to be necessarily easy, but as you push through and overcome, it's that sort of endurance and the ability to stick at it. It actually builds character, and that character gives you hope for the future as you become more able. But apart from developing ourselves, what we're told to do is that we also need to spend time in service to others. Greg Sheridan, who is a journalist with the Sydney Morning Herald and The Age, he's actually written a book called Christians, the Urgent Case for Jesus in Our World. And I believe what COVID's taught me and us generally in terms of a lesson is that there are a lot of people out there who, when the pressure came on, their lives were found to be wanting. Going back to my very first story I told at the beginning of the sermon, Rick McCosker. Rick McCosker lives in Newcastle. He's heavily involved. When he was interviewed, he said, look, I am a Christian, but I'm not religious. And unfortunately, a lot of Australians have become disenfranchised with organised church because of the sort of hypocrisy of some denominations. But he's heavily involved in the Seafarers Chapel that is down, is it in Wickham down there? I'm trying to remember the exact address of it. and he's heavily involved, taking those guys who get stuck on those ships that we see out to sea sometimes for months, and during their time on shore, making sure they're looked after as a ministry to his fellow humans. I just want to finish by saying you can be one of God's heroes. You can be. And all that I think we need to do is to sit back and say to God, pick me, develop me into a person. Let me be the one that has the chance to shine. And you'd be surprised what happens when push comes to shove. The end. Now, friends, would you like me to pray, or is there something else?
Yes.
Okay.
You before you do, firstly, thank you, Peter. That was fantastic. But I would like to say that we do have heroes right in Charlestown Church. We have Steve and Robin with Give Freedom that started in our church. So, you know, we have them as heroes. We also have, you know, we have Seamus and Jace, who are now trying to find jobs for Afghani refugees. And I'm excited. We have the doctors in our church who are looking after people, you know, like Colin and Debbie's not a doctor, but, you know, Steve's a doctor. You know what I mean? So, you know, Charlestown Church is full of heroes. And Bob, as the leader of the pack, you're a hero too. And I just want to pay homage to all of those people. And, you know, so many people in our congregation have their own little territories and they're heroes in them. So thank you, Peter, for that encouragement. And yes, if you would bless us further with a prayer, we thank you very much, and God be with you.
Thanks, Francine, and I'll certainly endorse everything you just said. We have got heroes. All of us can be heroes. And so amazing. Let's just pray as we finish. Hey, God, it's great we can be here as a church community, even though we're spread around Newcastle and getting together online. And we just thank you for the assurance of Scripture, actually, that at the end of the day, everything's going to be all right. We thank you for your promises. And even during the times that COVID, it's been a bit tough and a bit unsettling, but we also can learn lessons from these times about how we need to be not of the world, but sent into it and to be change agents. So we just ask for your Holy Spirit to be with us all and bless us to that end. Amen.